I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Richard Striner, by asking a question. What does the Art Deco Society, the Preservation Movement, and Abraham Lincoln have in common? The answer is Richard Striner. I met Professor Striner in the 80s while I was involved and he was the president of the Art Deco Society, and when he was an active participant and the moving force in preserving many important and interesting properties in the Washington, D.C. area. Through his efforts, many structures still stand, in particular, the restoration and use by the American Film Institute of the Silver Spring Theater is credited to Richard. Through all of this period, he had a strong interest in President Lincoln, including his publication in 1991 of Reviving the Legacy of Lincoln and the Two Roosevelts, published in the Aspen Institute Quarterly. As we approach the bicentennial, we are seeing many publications concerning President Lincoln. With Professor Striner's publication of Father Abraham, Lincoln's Relentless Struggle to End Slavery, we see his challenge to the notion of Lincoln as a moderate and a better perspective of Lincoln by showing how his fight to save the Union was always contingent on the ultimate phase-out of slavery. His work also challenges other views on Lincoln. Professor Striner has taught history at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland since 1988 and is a senior writer with the Dwight D. Eisenhower Memorial Commission. His writings have been diverse, including works on history, politics, economics, and historic preservation. It is with a great personal privilege that I introduce you to Professor Richard Striner.
Ever since the days in the 1850s, when Abraham Lincoln was accused by his political rival Stephen A. Douglas of being a secret Negro lover, the problem of attempting to guess the real nature of Lincoln's own thoughts on the issue of race, or more pointedly, his innermost feelings, has remained contentious. Douglas kept complaining that the stealthy intention of Lincoln was to launch an incremental assault against the ways of American white supremacy. Compare this contemporaneous charge with the recent polemics of Lerone Bennett, Jr., who alleges that Lincoln was in favor of white supremacy. The problem of Lincoln and race has continued to challenge us. Professional historians and scholars have been arguing about this subject for a very long time. The basis for the argument is simple. Lincoln said certain things in the 1850s that appear to be racist in intention. Three distinct possibilities confront us. One, the possibility that Lincoln was indeed a white racist, though clearly an unusual one. Two, the possibility that Lincoln was pretending for political reasons to emotions he did not really have on the subject of race, that is, he was consciously deceiving the public. And three, the possibility that Lincoln was truly ambivalent in regard to the subject of race. That is, he was struggling both with his powerful conscience and with deep and persistent inner bigotry. It may be tempting for a number of reasons to embrace this third possibility as somehow the likeliest one. But a vigorous review of all the evidence suggests that the likeliest scenario is actually the second one, that Lincoln was twisting the truth for political reasons as he uttered what appeared to be white supremacist sentiments. It is vital to remember two historical facts as we begin. By the 1840s, the American anti-slavery movement comprised much more than just the sorts of idealistic abolitionists who embraced full equality for blacks. It also comprised a diverse coalition of whites, including a substantial number of racists, who feared and opposed the institution of slavery because they were convinced it was a threat to themselves. Such whites understood that if the institution of slavery should spread beyond the southern states, it could take away their jobs and depress the value of their labor. What they wanted was to keep both slavery and blacks out of sight. Furthermore, by the 1850s, the state of Illinois, where Lincoln had begun his career, was without a doubt one of the most militantly white supremacist states in the North. Free blacks had been barred under law from setting foot in the state, and the practice of racial intermarriage had been made illegal. This was the political climate in which Lincoln had to work before his destiny took him to the White House. One of the earliest statements by Lincoln that appears to support the charge of white supremacist values was a statement that he made in the course of his famous Peoria speech of October 16, 1854. This speech was an attack upon the Kansas-Nebraska Act that was championed by one of Illinois' very own United States Senators, Stephen Douglas. The act allowed slavery to spread into parts of the Louisiana Purchase in which the institution had been barred for many years. Before we turn to the statement by Lincoln that appears to be racist, it behooves us to glance at some other vital portions of the speech. In attacking the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln told his white supremacist listeners to look beyond the threat that the institution of slavery might pose to themselves. He told them to consider the brutality of slavery itself. It was an evil that deprived human beings, fellow human beings who were black, of their unalienable rights. Listen to his words. Quote, "Equal justice to the South," it is said, "requires us to consent to the extending of slavery to new countries. That is to say, inasmuch as you do not object to my taking my hog to Nebraska, therefore I must not object to you taking your slave. Now, I admit this is perfectly illogical if there is no difference between hogs and Negroes, but while you thus require me to deny the humanity of the Negro, I wish to ask whether you of the South yourselves have ever been willing to do as much," unquote. In referring to the people of the South, Lincoln asked his Midwestern listeners to think about the spectacle of guilty white Southerners who freed their slaves over time. Quote, "There are in the United States and Territories," Lincoln pointed out, "433,643 free blacks," unquote. How could this have happened if blacks were merely beasts of burden? Quote, "How comes this vast amount of property to be running around without owners?" Lincoln asked. "We do not see free horses or free cattle running at large. How is this? All these free blacks are the descendants of slaves, or have been slaves themselves, and they would be slaves now, but for something which has operated on their white owners, inducing them at vast pecuniary sacrifices to liberate them," unquote. Lincoln pressed the argument further. By the way, when I give verbal emphasis to the word something here, I'm following the transcribed text in the collected works. It's in all caps. Lincoln pressed the argument further, quote, "What is that something? Is there any mistaking it? In all these cases, it is your sense of justice and human sympathy continually telling you that the poor Negro has some natural right to himself, that those who deny it and make mere merchandise of him deserve kickings, contempt, and death. If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal," unquote. Now, consider the passage that the latter-day critics of Lincoln have attacked as being racist. In his Peoria speech, Lincoln chose to look beyond the urgent short-term goal of keeping slavery from spreading to the territories. He talked about the long-term emancipation challenge. He embraced the idea of transatlantic colonization, the idea of sending former slaves back to Africa or elsewhere when slavery had ended. The idea, for some, had great religious resonance, as the Hebrews of old had been led from the house of bondage and returned to the promised land of the patriarchs. So the latter-day African Israel deserved a providential repatriation on an epical scale. Now, to be sure, there were numerous blacks who were clearly offended by the directly insulting connotations of a program to ship them out of the country. Nonetheless, a substantial number of blacks had gone willingly to live in Liberia, a land that was founded to provide a safe haven for people of African descent who found the white supremacist culture of 19th century America oppressive, those who, like Marcus Garvey later on, could see no reason to linger in a land of white supremacy. Regardless, here's the statement by Lincoln that is cited by some as a blatantly racist manifesto. Quote, "If all earthly power were given me," Lincoln stated, "I should not know what to do as to the existing institution of slavery. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves, and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope, as I think there may be in this in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible. If they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days, and there are not surplus shipping and surplus money enough in the world to carry them there in many times 10 days. What then? Free them and keep them among us as underlings? Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? I think I would not hold one in slavery at any rate, yet the point is not clear enough for me to denounce people upon. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. Whether this feeling accords with justice and sound judgment is not the sole question, if indeed it is any part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-grounded, cannot be safely disregarded, unquote. What are we to make of this statement? Lincoln's feelings, he said, would not support the idea of making blacks the civic equals of whites after slavery was gone. He went on, however, to explore a most interesting conjecture, and one that makes very little sense for any racist to toy with in public, if, he pointed out, his own feelings should eventually embrace the idea of granting civil rights to blacks, the great mass of white people would oppose him. Why mention this scenario at all? A mere racist, one is tempted to presume, would simply state his opposition to equality for blacks and then leave the matter right there. Indeed, why should Lincoln, as a putative racist, take on the abundantly risky and politically gratuitous chore of convincing an Illinois audience that blacks and their feelings really mattered? The most obvious way for a racist politician to attack Stephen Douglas in front of the voters was to harp upon the menace of slavery to working-class whites. But Lincoln used the opportunity to soften up his listeners' resistance, to urge them to transcend their prejudice and view black slaves as fellow men, as fellow human beings. Consider what Lincoln was up against. Consider the inflammatory rhetoric of Stephen A. Douglas, who regaled the electorate with unabashed racist appeals. Here's an excerpt that shows the man in action. Please remember that the audience reactions in the passage were recorded by journalists trained in stenography. Quote, "I ask you," Douglas thundered to the voters, "are you in favor of conferring upon the Negro the rights and privileges of citizenship? No, no. Do you desire to strike out of our state constitution that clause which keeps slaves and free Negroes out of the state and allow the Negroes to flow in? Never. And cover your prairies with black settlements? Do you desire to turn this beautiful state into a free Negro colony? No, no. In order that when Missouri abolishes slavery, she can send 100,000 emancipated slaves into Illinois to become citizens and voters on an equality with yourselves? Never. No. If you desire Negro citizenship, then support Mr. Lincoln and the Black Republican Party. For one, I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. Cheers. I believe this government was made on the white basis. Good. I believe it was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, unquote. Now here was a racist. And he frequently invoked the threat of interracial sex, miscegenation, or amalgamation, as he called it in the parlance of the times, to work his audience to fever pitch. In one speech, for example, Douglas sneered to some partisan detractors as follows, quote, "If you, black Republicans, think that the Negro ought to be on a social equality with your wives and daughters and ride in a carriage with your wife whilst you drive the team, you have a perfect right to do so," unquote. Douglas was counting on the phobias of Illinois whites as he engaged in this salacious demagoguery. Lincoln was obliged to respond. On June 26, 1857, in the course of a significant address that he delivered at Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln acknowledged the, quote, "disgust in the minds of nearly all white people to the idea of an indiscriminate amalgamation of the white and black races," unquote. Lincoln responded to this widespread disgust in a number of ways. At times, he urged the voters to transcend it, Douglas, Lincoln said in his Springfield address, quote, finds the Republicans insisting that the Declaration of Independence includes all men, black as well as white, and forthwith he boldly denies that it includes Negroes at all, and proceeds to argue gravely that all who contend it does do so only because they want to vote and eat and sleep and marry with Negroes. Now I protest against the counterfeit logic, which concludes that because I do not want a black woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. I need not have her for either. I can just leave her alone, unquote. He also tried to make fun of the issue through the methods of tongue-in-cheek humor. At another point in the address, he said that there were fortunately, quote, white men enough to marry all the white women and black men enough to marry all the black women, and so let them be married, unquote. A clever ploy. He took the ugly and nasty innuendos of Douglas and rebutted them with gentle forms of whimsy. Whereas Douglas appealed to the brutal and even pornographic feelings of the voters, he talked, we recall, of the Negro riding in a carriage with your wife whilst you drive the team. One thinks of Madame Bovary. Ever read that? Lincoln tried to distract and amuse his touchy audience with visions of benign mass weddings. But such evasions evidently did not do the trick. For Lincoln also made the following explicit statement in the Springfield address that appears to be racist indeed. Douglas, he said, was, quote, especially horrified by the thought of the mixing of the blood by the white and black races. Agreed for once, 1,000 times agreed, unquote. This would seem to resolve the matter quickly. Lincoln was a racist. Or was he? Here was a man who alleged that, like Douglas, he was horrified, quote unquote, revolted and appalled by the prospect of interracial sex. And then he joked about the subject, and he tried to make light of it whenever Douglas raised the issue. He repeatedly attempted to persuade his white listeners to spurn this issue as a foolish one. They should think about the evil of enslavement, he repeatedly insisted. This leads us to the issue of candor. Was Lincoln really telling the truth about his feelings on racial intermarriage? Perhaps he was. Or perhaps he was faking it for reasons of political strategy. Douglas, after all, had been successfully distracting the voters from the slavery issue by pandering to racial aversions. Lincoln, on the other hand, was trying to force consideration of the slavery question and to render the subject of interracial sex a non-issue as much as he could. As he launched his campaign to remove Stephen Douglas from the Senate in 1858, Lincoln openly called for the cessation of race-conscious thinking in America. On the evening of July 10, 1858, he exhorted his supporters at a torchlight rally to, quote, discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people, unquote. He chanted out the following questions and angry admonitions, quote, I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who is so bold to do it? Voices, me. No one. If it is not true, let us tear it out. Cries of no, no, unquote. Douglas's response was to accuse his rival of opening Pandora's box. He contended that Lincoln was in favor, secretly in favor, of giving social equality to blacks. He demanded that Lincoln address the issue clearly. He kept insisting that Lincoln answer the following question. Did he or did he not intend to lead the American people by stealthy degrees to a mongrelized, amalgamated future? Lincoln's response was both forthright and shifty. On July 17th, he fought back by accusing Douglas of attempting to put words in his mouth. Quote, last night, Lincoln said, Judge Douglas, and it bears noting here that Lincoln was referring to the earlier service of Douglas on the Illinois Supreme Court. Judge Douglas tormented himself with horrors about my disposition to make Negroes perfectly equal with white men in social and political relations. He did not stop to show that I had said any such thing, or that it legitimately follows from anything I have said, but he rushes in with his assertions. I adhere to the Declaration of Independence. If Judge Douglas and his friends are not willing to stand by it, let them come up and amend it. Let them make it read that all men are created equal except Negroes, unquote. Lincoln then went on to embrace full equality for blacks when it came to their freedom, while demurring in slippery terms on the ancillary issues. Quote, certainly, Lincoln stated, certainly the Negro is not our equal in color, perhaps not in other respects. Still, in the right to put into his mouth the bread that his own hands have earned, he is the equal of every other man, white or black. All that I ask for the Negro is that if you do not like him, leave him alone, unquote. This was very clever language indeed. On the surface, Lincoln seemed to be embracing a few racist platitudes, but his language, which appears to have been carefully chosen, could convey alternative meanings. Consider the following sentence. Quote, certainly the Negro is not our equal in color and perhaps not in other respects, unquote. Let us analyze the sentence as to meaning, beginning with certainly, a very clear term. What was certain, according to Lincoln? That the Negro is, quote, not our equal in color, unquote. And yet the meaning of the crucial term equal was notoriously vague in this particular statement. Was Lincoln saying that the darker pigmentation of blacks was less worthy than the skin tone of whites? Or was he merely observing that the black and white skin tone was different, that is, not equal in the sense of not the same? If the latter, then the difference in question was trivial, a matter of taste. If one happened not to like the appearance of others, one could obviously leave them alone, as Lincoln said quite clearly at the very end of the statement. What else? Lincoln then went on to observe that, quote, perhaps, unquote, other racial differences existed. Note the qualifier term, perhaps, which was heard by many, no doubt, in the positive sense that perhaps they do exist, but with its flip-side corollary left to be inferred by discerning minds, perhaps they do not. It is certainly possible to argue that Lincoln was guardedly revealing between the lines of this speech that he did not really know whether blacks and whites were really different aside from their skin tone. But in all probability, it sounded like he said or implied that he did know. No wonder that his enemy Douglas would complain in the course of the Lincoln-Douglas debate that Lincoln possessed, quote, a fertile genius in devising language to conceal his thoughts, unquote. In the course of the debates, which lasted from August through October 1858, Douglas constantly tried to bait Lincoln on the subject of race. Lincoln chose to fend off this abuse with some clear-sounding statements like the following, quote, I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality, and inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position, unquote. The common reading of the statement is simple. Lincoln was a self-proclaimed racist. But consider an alternative reading. If Lincoln, who was after all a highly successful attorney, well versed in the arts of concocting ambiguous language to emerge from tight situations, was in fact playing games of deception with the audience, the ploy might have worked like this. Sentence 1, quote, I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races, unquote. Translation, I have no intention at the moment, no purpose of trying to introduce political and social equality between the two races in light of the existing political realities. Sentence 2, clause 1, quote, there is a physical difference between the two which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality, unquote. Translation, pure hatred arising from their physical differences will probably continue to generate the kinds of interracial tensions that will make a really tolerant society impossible. Sentence 2, Clause 2, quote, and inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position, unquote. Translation, if there must be a difference in the power positions of the races because of the political reasons just explained, then I would obviously not choose subjection. If this reading of Lincoln's careful language is valid, then his racist-sounding statements in the course of the debates were merely gambits of a clever attorney. They were not necessarily the statements of an actual racist. If anything, they seemed to be the statements of a man who, for political reasons, was deeply pessimistic when it came to the prospect for black civil rights in America. Regardless, Lincoln was determined to strike at the fountainhead of racist doctrine, the notion that blacks were a subhuman species. He did this in 1859 in the course of some speeches that he gave in Ohio. In some notes that he made before drafting these speeches, he focused on a statement that Douglas had made within the previous year. Quote, at Memphis, Lincoln wrote, Douglas told his audience that he was for the Negro against the crocodile, but for the white man against the Negro. This was not a sudden thought spontaneously thrown off at Memphis. He said the same thing many times in Illinois last summer and autumn, though I am not sure it was reported then. It is a carefully framed illustration of the estimate he places on the Negro and the manner in which he would have him dealt with. It's a sort of proposition in proportion. As the Negro is to the crocodile, so the white man is to the Negro. As the Negro ought to treat the crocodile as a beast, so the white man ought to treat the Negro as a beast, unquote. These were notes for speeches. Now consider the fervor Lincoln brought to the subject when he spoke to a crowd in Columbus, Ohio on September 16, 1859. Quote, did you ever 5 years ago hear of anybody in the world saying that the Negro had no share in the Declaration of National Independence, that it did not mean Negroes at all, and when all men were spoken of, Negroes were not included? I have been unable at any time to find a man in an audience who would declare that he had ever known anybody saying so 5 years ago, but last year there was not a Douglas supporter in Illinois who did not say it, unquote. How far had this sinister change of opinion proceeded in Ohio, Lincoln wondered. How many in Ohio now believed that the Negro was excluded from the Declaration of Independence? Quote, if you think that now, Lincoln pressed his audience, and did not think it then, the next thing that strikes me is to remark that there has been a change wrought in you, laughter and applause, and a very significant change it was, being no less than changing the Negro in your estimation from the rank of a man to that of a brute. They're taking him down and placing him, when spoken of, among reptiles and crocodiles, as Judge Douglas himself expresses it. I ask you to note that fact, and the like of which is to follow, to be plastered on layer after layer until very soon you're prepared to deal with the Negro everywhere as with a brute. If public sentiment has not been debauched already to this point, a new turn of the screw in that direction is all that is wanting, unquote. Let us pause and consider. Is it possible to argue that a speech such as this could be delivered by a gut-level racist? Not likely. The gut-level feelings of Lincoln appeared to be repelled by the racist mentality. Almost 50 years ago, historian David Herbert Donald concluded that Lincoln, quote, was colorblind. He thought of the black man, first of all, as a man, unquote. Nonetheless, Lincoln seemed pessimistic with regard to the prospects for changing the mainstream culture when it came to civil rights for blacks. So his long-term vision, at least until 1863, was to strike at the evil of slavery and then, as a long-term voluntary proposition, lay the groundwork for peaceful separation of the races through colonization. After Lincoln's election to the presidency in 1860, an event that quickly unleashed the secessionist movement in the South, Lincoln used the vision of colonization to pacify racist opponents in the North, especially those who denounced his Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. On August 14, 1862, about a month or so before he actually released the proclamation, Lincoln spoke about the prospects for colonization to a group of black leaders at the White House. He made it clear to these blacks that he shared their feelings in regard to the oppressiveness of white supremacy. Quote, your race, Lincoln said, are suffering the greatest wrong inflicted on any people. On this broad continent, not a single man of your race is made the equal of a single man of ours, unquote. And this, he continued, was, quote, a fact about which we all think and feel alike, I and you, unquote. Take note, Lincoln told his black listeners he shared their feelings in respect to the loathsomeness of white supremacy. But alas, he continued, racist culture was, quote, a fact with which we have to deal, for I cannot change it, unquote. Lincoln then urged his listeners to think about the prospect as a voluntary measure, he assured them, of moving to a country whose inhabitants were free of racial bigotry. If Africa should prove too distant or foreign, then perhaps a destination among the more racially mixed population of Central America should be considered. Quote, to your colored race, Lincoln stated, quote, unquote, the peoples of Central America, quote, have no objection, unquote. And if blacks wish to found a new society there, quote, I would endeavor to have you made equals and have the best assurance that you should be the equals of the best, unquote. Some blacks took him up on the offer later on, though their point of destination was an island off the coast of Haiti. But as Lincoln continued to experiment with colonization, he increasingly opened his mind to the vision of creating a tolerant and multiracial society here in America. He began in a number of speeches and letters to argue with the racists and to work on public opinion. In his annual message to Congress on December 1st, 1862, for instance, Lincoln pointedly observed that if the black population, both free and enslaved, were, quote, distributed among the whites of the whole country, there would be but one color to 7 whites, unquote. That being the case, he reasoned, why should whites have anything to fear? But more importantly, Lincoln continued, quote, there are many communities now having more than one free colored person to 7 whites, and this without any apparent consciousness of evil from it, unquote. In 1863, when he decided to permit the enlistment of blacks in the Army, he immediately used the opportunity to shame white supremacists by praising black valor on the battlefield. On August 26, 1863, for instance, in a letter to a friend that he intended for release to the general public, Lincoln scolded Northern racists in the following patriotic manner, quote, peace does not appear so distant as it did. I hope it will come soon and come to stay, and so come as to be worth the keeping in all future time. And then there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet they have helped mankind on to this great consummation, while I fear there will be some white ones unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech they have strove to hinder it, unquote. In the same year, he instructed his military officers to work with the hundreds of thousands of slaves who were then being given their freedom by dint of the Emancipation Proclamation. He told General Nathaniel Banks in Louisiana to be sure that any interim labor regulations should embrace, quote, some practical system by which the two races could gradually live themselves out of their old relation to each other and both come out better prepared for the new, unquote. He added that, quote, education for young blacks should be included in this plan, unquote. In Mississippi, Lincoln instructed General Stephen Hurlbut, an old friend from Illinois whom he knew he could trust, to make provision for the needs of former slaves. Quote, if there be plantations near you which are abandoned by their owners, Lincoln wrote, first, put as many contrabands, former slaves, on such as they will hold, that is, as can draw subsistence from them. If some still remain, get loyal men of character in the vicinity to take them temporarily on wages to be paid to the contrabands themselves, such men obliging themselves to not let the contrabands be kidnapped or forcibly taken away. Of course, if any voluntarily make arrangements to work for their living, you will not hinder them, unquote. Most interesting of all, Lincoln chose to endorse an experiment through which some plantation lands in the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina would be sold to former slaves who had tilled the land for rebel masters. Lincoln instructed his agents in the islands to set aside lots of 20 acres for, quote, heads of families of the African race for the charitable purpose of providing homes for such heads of families and their families, respectively, unquote. In 1864, Lincoln pushed for the empowerment of blacks in the area of voting rights. He secretly encouraged the occupation governor of Louisiana to consider such a plan. The new Constitution of Louisiana, though deferring a clear-cut decision, had empowered the legislature to confer the elective franchise, quote-unquote, on blacks. It should be noted here that the states had an absolute right to determine the credentials of voters, and this situation would prevail until the drafting and ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. On April 11, 1865, Lincoln openly sided with the advocates of black voting rights in Louisiana. Speaking of the situation at hand, Lincoln said he knew it was, quote, unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not yet given to the colored man, unquote. Then he made the big announcement at last, quote, I would myself prefer, he revealed, that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers, unquote. Lincoln shifted in a moment to a boldly charismatic tone as he encouraged the voting rights movement in the South. If we firmly support the new Louisiana Constitution, as well as the people who drafted it, Lincoln intoned, quote, we encourage the hearts and nerve the arms, unquote, of all the decent and tolerant whites in the state. We help them, quote, to adhere to their work and argue for it and proselyte for it and fight for it and feed it and grow it and ripen it to complete success. The colored man, too, in seeing all united for him, is inspired with vigilance and energy and daring to the same end, unquote. John Wilkes Booth was in the audience when Lincoln made the speech. That means nigger citizenship, Booth muttered to his fellow conspirators when Lincoln had finished. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he will ever make. We return once again to the question, was Lincoln a racist? It is possible to argue that he certainly was, while conceding that his feelings on the issue seemed to change and evolve over time. But it is also possible to argue that Lincoln was a brilliant enemy of racists. He was a clever and incremental fighter who attempted to work against the fact of white prejudice by carefully measured degrees. In his Springfield address back in 1857, he had talked about the meaning of equality. He argued that by signing their names to a document proclaiming as a universal truth the proposition that all men are created equal, America's founders set a goal for all future generations. They meant to, quote, declare the right, unquote. Lincoln said, the right of all men to be regarded and treated as equal, quote, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere, unquote. Lincoln used this method as he sought to raise the status of blacks. He summoned power, moral, political, military, patriotic power to enforce the moral promise of America. To begin, he conferred the most basic of rights, the right to be free. Then, as soon as political contingencies permitted it, he strove to look beyond the great cause of emancipation, to explore whether public opinion, both North and South, could be pushed to embrace civil rights. It seems that Douglas was right after all when he had sounded the alarm about Lincoln in the 1850s. In all likelihood, Lincoln was a Negro lover, just as Douglas had claimed all along. Without question, Lincoln was a strategist, a great moral strategist, the greatest of his kind that this country has ever produced. As a strategist, Lincoln was tricky at times, but his deceptions were in all probability ploys to outmaneuver the racists. By twisting the truth in his encounters with Douglas, by producing an ingenious political rhetoric that synthesized truth, half-truth, and deception, Lincoln summoned the political power that would liberate millions and would open up a path to civil rights. It was our nation's greatest loss that he was killed at the moment when he was. Who can say how far he might have gone if he had lived to complete his second term? We can only conjecture. Thank you.
We have time for some questions and answers, and just before we start that, I want to just make a historical footnote. We have the Institute has a continuing relationship with the archives whereby we have a speaker that shows up at the archives, usually noon or late in the afternoon, and Richard has done that for us once, and during the middle of his presentation, the fire alarms went off. His audience was so engrossed that we all went out and sat on the front steps of the National Archives downtown to hear him conclude his speech. Barry, wait for the mic, please.
Well, I can hear you from here. If you want to, I can restate your question from the podium.
Thank you very much.
Testing.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Here are my two questions. First, with typical Republican, I think with your again, the Republican. And my question is, I would like to have your thoughts on the connection between the personal views of a president on issues like race and policy. In Israel, saved Israel in 1973. I'm thinking of Harry Truman, who was reared an anti-Semite, and yet he helped to create it. I'm thinking of FDR, who was moderate on race, yet he would veto any anti-lynching bill. I'm thinking of LBJ, who was at best a moderate on race, and yet he is the great champion of civil rights. So again, your thoughts on the connection between personal views and policies.
Mm-hmm. Sure. First part of the question is, to what extent do I believe that a typical Republican of the period would view Lincoln in the manner that I do now? Is that it? Well, I'm hard-pressed to say what a typical Republican view would be. I haven't done any direct research on primary sources from the 1850s or 60s that would give me some quantifiable basis for speaking in aggregate terms as to what is typical. The Republican Party was a very new party, and it was a fusion movement of anti-slavery Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats. And many of the anti-slavery Democrats, the Democratic Party being a substantially white supremacist party since the 1830s, were certainly adherents of the Free Soil movement, and yet also white supremacists, the logic of which I tried to summarize quickly in the course of my presentation, so that for Republicans of that sort, newly defrocked Democrats, former Democrats, the answer would be one thing. For radical Republicans, the answer would be quite another. And then there was a group of so-called moderate Republicans, expressing many different shadings and gradations of opinion in between. And what Lincoln sort that he shot down in December 1860, the Crittenden Compromise that would have permitted slavery to expand, and Lincoln told Republicans, kill it. Kill it. If he only wanted to save the Union, why did he do that? Yes, to move to the second part of your question, certainly there is often an important difference between the private beliefs of individuals, conscious or unconscious, and their policies as practitioners of statecraft, practitioners of politics. And as to the particular calibration of similarity or difference between the innermost feelings, principles, and ideals of these people and what they practically do via politics, the art of the possible, that will vary from one person to another. If I were talking about FDR or Truman or Nixon, I might come to substantially different conclusions than the ones I've come to about Lincoln. But in going through, all of the documents and thinking it through very carefully over the course of a very long time, about 30 years I've been pondering this, talking to people about it, It's the only way it makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense any other way. I mean, if you try to work it out some other way, there's always some part that doesn't quite work. Whereas approaching it this way, the way I do in my new book, to me, it fits it fits together like a Swiss watch. I can't prove that I'm totally right about Lincoln's inner feelings on race, but it's the only way it makes sense. If he were a gut-level racist, why go to all the trouble of defending the rights of blacks? He didn't have to do that, and he didn't have to use emancipation to save the Union. He could have freed it the racist Democratic way, opened peace negotiations with the South, reunified the Union on Calhoun principles, and there you've saved the Union. But he refused.
Lincoln was not a racist, but he certainly had differences with Stevens and Sumner. And I would think that if another professor would go through Stevens and Sumner versus Lincoln like you did with Douglas and Lincoln, you might have as big a gulf between Stevens and Sumner as Lincoln. Isn't that a useful perspective in a context that he was very much a middle-of-the-roader and Stevens and Sumner were the true friends of equality and the vision of America that we have now rather than Lincoln?
That is a very important question, and I'm delighted that you asked it. I agree with you to the extent of regarding Stevens, Sumner, and people like that as true mid-19th century pioneers of 20th century civil rights. They played a vital catalytic role. If such things were to happen, somebody had to start demanding them sometime. But with regard to the difference in moral or political value, short-term and long-term, between the radical Republicans and Lincoln, I think it's a different sort of question. I have to add that until 1864, Sumner really supported Lincoln and told his fellow radicals to just cool it. He said, he's working incrementally. His policies are a wedge in the door for the sort of things that we stand for. I've talked to him privately. His heart is with us. Let him do it and stop carping. Now, in 1864, a schism between the two began to develop, but the crucial difference to me is that Lincoln was an executive power orchestrator. He needed the agitation of people like Stevens and Sumner, and he used it synergistically. But being an insider power orchestrator, building coalitions, he had to take cognizance of support that he needed from people who didn't share the position of the radical Republicans. He had to take cognizance of worst-case possibilities, like losing the election of 1864, having a Democratic president and a Supreme Court still presided over by Roger Brooke Taney, ruled the Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional. He had to deal with the prospect of losing this thing in a way that could set back the anti-slavery movement for about half a century. He had to weigh and balance short-term, long-term, best-case, worst-case contingencies in a way that, frankly, Wendell Phillips and Thaddeus Stevens had the luxury of avoiding. They didn't have to figure out the power strategy to make it happen, with fallback positions in case unpredictable problems came out. Lincoln was dealing with that night and day. That's the difference. You need both, in my opinion. You need the moral agitators, and you need the inside power orchestrator to make it happen. One more.
Question. Do you view Lincoln's comment that he was personally opposed to black men holding political office as merely more deception, or possibly as a reflection that as a product of his times, Lincoln did perceive a racial difference, although being vehemently opposed to slavery?
Well, trying to recall what I said in my paper about this, there is, of course, a difference between the sorts of things Lincoln said and did in the 1850s and the things he said and did, in the 1860s. There's a difference between what he said and did in any given year of the Civil War. And you look at the trajectory and how it was constantly, expanding toward greater support for black civil rights. You consider that. Maybe the man developed and changed. Maybe his mind became more liberated and he was able to successfully shed earlier prejudices. That's possible. I acknowledged in here that there's no way to absolutely prove this. It's a matter of inference. But in terms of inference and the sense and the logic of what was done, go all the way back to the 1850s and ask yourself, if he really were a white racist, why go to all the trouble of talking and agitating and empathizing with blacks? He didn't have to do that to win support from the Free Soil movement. Just focus on the threat of slavery to whites. And then, as to the things he actually said, read it very carefully. Look at how slippery they were. Look at how slippery they were. Put it all together, and this is the way it makes sense to me, I doubt very much that Lincoln was an actual racist, but given the political realities in 1850s Illinois, he had to make it sound like he might be.
One more quick one.
Okay, this is I think relating to that same theory. You said that Lincoln had to respond to Douglas, but my understanding is that Lincoln basically dogged Douglas and would show up where he was speaking the day after he spoke. And it's if you can't find a good fight, start one. Until Douglas finally acceded to a series of debates. It sounds as though a man who was in a lucrative law practice was out there looking for a crusade.
Well, I agree with pretty much everything you said, but I would put it a little bit differently. Yes, he had a lucrative law practice, but something happened to Lincoln in 1854. This tremendous outrage was unleashed that propelled him down a path from which there would be no retreat. You're absolutely right that he dogged Douglas. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, Don Fehrenbacher, in his book Prelude to Greatness, very cleverly suggested that Lincoln's path to the White House consisted of constantly hounding Douglas and making a big name for himself that way. You're absolutely right. It was a matter of hot pursuit and attack. But then Douglas counterattacked on the issue that made Lincoln most vulnerable with Illinois voters' race. So it's a matter of thrust, counter-thrust, attack, defense, counterattack. That's what was going on. So I think you're right, and I think I'm right. I think that these are observations that do justice to different sides of the Lincoln-Douglas war in the 1850s.
Michael, do you have one? I'm going to allow one more question because fellow board member.
This is just a quick footnote to the question about Stevens and Sumner versus Lincoln. And the implication is that the difference between the radicals and Lincoln was significant and severe. Actually, in 1864, William Lloyd Garrison, the radical of all radicals, the founder of the anti-slavery movement, the most inflammatory of all the abolitionists to getting the anti-slavery movement off the ground, said just what you've said. Lincoln is not a newspaper editor. He is not a preacher. He is not without responsibility for leading the country to victory in the war. And therefore, we have to appreciate that he can't say and do what we would do, and we should support him wholeheartedly. And Garrison had a lot of other radicals who were in his corner.
Can I make one follow-up? There is a source, which I have used in my book, a memoir written by a Virginia-born abolitionist named Moncure Daniel Conway. The memoir was published in 1904, so it goes a long way back. About a meeting that he and another abolitionist had with Lincoln at the White House in January 1862. And they were urging him at that point to expand the meaning of the war, to embrace emancipation. And according to Conway's recollection, Lincoln said, in effect, I'm moving toward that, and you can help. I think we may be able to do it after a while. I think it may be in the manner suggested, and this is a joke about the temperance movement at the time. Maine was a legally dry state. So Lincoln said in dialect, as Conway recorded it, it may be in the way suggested by a thirsty soul in Maine who found that his robust appearance forbade the plea of sickness and that he could only get liquor from a druggist, and that he told his friend, the pharmacist, couldn't you put a drop of the Creta into it, unbeknownst to yourself? Your right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And then Lincoln said, you can help. I want you to go out there and generate as much, abolitionist pressure upon me as possible, and you can say anything you like about me, if that will help. Don't spare me. Now, it's a memoir written a long time later, and yet, in a letter that the abolitionist Wendell Phillips wrote a month later, Phillips said that he had paid a call upon Lincoln, and Lincoln had used the same drop of the creature anecdote with him. Now, that's two completely independent, contemporaneous sources 1 month apart. It's not in the collected works. It's a reminiscence, but it certainly sounds like a convincing one coming from these two sources. And what does that tell you? It's an insider-outsider orchestration. Lincoln setting it up to actually encourage his critics to call him names, to increase his leverage to do things they both wanted. But it couldn't be made to appear like that. I mean, can you think of any other president who encouraged his friends to call him names and besmirch his reputation?
Great. Thank you.
Okay.